Welcome back to Inner Circle Minis. This week, from the Mortal Realms magazine collection, I am painting Kurdos Valentian, the Craven King. So, getting right into it here, I've gone ahead and obviously made a base for this guy and primed him with a white primer, and I'm now giving the throne an all over coat of mechanicus standard grey. Now obviously this is going to get a couple of coats to get it on nice and smooth. Now in regards to where the throne sides become the spooky trail bits, all I do there is just bring it up slightly towards where the trails would become the throne, and basically just stop. Just leave it thinned, the paint thinned down, and just get it a sort of a little bit more than a glaze, you know, a couple of layers on there. But you don't want it a solid opaque colour like the rest of the throne, and this is going to make it easier for blending into the spooky trails a little bit later on. And the same with the stretched ghost thing that's on the back part of the throne seat there, the faces, leave those in white as well. All I did was painted in between the mouths with the grey, and then obviously all around them, around the back, and also underneath between the ghosty bits. Right, following that, I'm now taking a nuln oil wash and just applying this as a thin glaze across the stone to get a nice even coat without any pooling or anything. And in areas where there's some extra detailing, sort of just behind the skulls on the front there, as well as the piece at the top, I'll let that pool a little bit more, just so that it gets into the recesses. And then with the cracks running down either side of the throne, I'll obviously pull that into those a little bit, and then just gently brush across the top to make sure there's no staining on the either side of the crack. All I want is for that shade to go into the crack, and then just a smooth even glaze of the grey or the nuln oil over the top to make sure that it's all blended in. I'll then obviously leave that for about 15 minutes to dry, and then I can come back in with the next step. Okay, so after a few minutes of the nuln oil drying, to the point where it's not going to move around and pool or anything, I'm just going in and with some abaddon black, brushing up the cloak, the darker portions of the ghosts. What I wanted for these was a similar look to that on the Games Workshop website, that also fits in with the theme of my army, where the spookiness is darker, with that sort of that dark coming down into a sort of a blue green and then fading off into the white. So all I'm doing with this is, as I said, starting off with some thin coats and working from the edge of the hood, which is going to be a different colour, coming down onto the, we'll call them ghost trails, onto the ghost trails slightly, or stopping, you know, just as they start, and working my way with multiple layers going over the top, stopping a little further back each time, and this gives me the sort of a start to the fade effect. Okay, so for this next part, I'm working in sort of two stages. I'm using some nighthaunt gloom here, and just getting a straight up coat down the ghost trails, and obviously starting on the black a little bit. Now what I'm also doing is thinning down the paint by dipping it into some water, just straight from the brush, dip the brush into the water and go back over. And what this will do is spread out that paint a little bit thinner. Basically I'm thinning, get my speech right, I am thinning the paint on the model. So instead of putting some on a palette and going thin, I'm using it straight from the pot neat, putting it on the model, rinsing the brush off quickly, and then just touching it to paper towel just to remove some of the excess, and then putting it down and spreading it about. This way I can control the paint how I want it and get it to move to where I want it to go. What I then do for the sides is the same kind of thing. I'll apply it to the ghost trails, and where they blend into the stonework of the throne, I go just over the stonework slightly, and then I'll dip back into the water and thin it slightly, and basically just sort of blend it onto that stonework a little bit. I know the line work there is harsh where the transition is, but with a couple of layers over the top and working with the watered down paint, all I'm doing here is, where the brush goes off camera, is I'm just touching the tip into some clean water just to thin it down on the brush a little bit to fade it off. And you can see I leave it a little bit thicker on the throne itself, and then just blend that in. And when that dries, that's going to darken down a little bit, and you can see here I'm wiping some excess off, coming back over that join line, and that's smoothing it out. Okay, so moving back onto the throne, I'm just taking some dawnstone and a small dry brush and removing obviously a lot of the excess paint until there's barely anything on the brush, and I'm then giving this a couple of coats over the stone of the throne. Yeah, nice little rhyme there, stone of the throne. And yeah, I'm just basically trying to pick up the edge highlights in this lighter colour and lighten off some of the flatter areas slightly. What this will do is get rid of that slightly mottled look that the nuln oil can leave on a flat surface, even with the glazing it on rather than washing it on. You can still get a little bit of a mottled sort of patchy look. So the dawnstone just obviously smooths that out and hides those little bits, as well as picks up all of the hard edges on the stonework. Okay, and next up, using some ulthuan grey and again the dry brush, I'm going over all the ghost trails. Now what I'm doing is not removing a full amount of the paint. I'm removing the majority of it and leaving a little bit, so that when I start on the end of the trails where I want it to be whitest, that will apply some of the paint, and by the time I finish dry brushing that small area, the excess, or the brush has become pretty much dry brushing, and then I can work that up the ghost trails. Now what I do recommend when doing any kind of dry brushing is, when you apply more paint to the bristles and you wipe it off, start back over your lightest point. So in the case of this, it will be the tips where they are white. That way, if there is too much paint on the bristles, you're not going to put that in the middle of an area that should be a blend, you know, that should have a light amount of paint applied to it. Basically, you'll remove any excess off the end of the model. You can sort of test it there. You could also obviously test it on your hand, just do a bit of brushing there and make sure that there's enough paint on there that you want. But I find that even sometimes doing that, you can end up with a couple of bristles that have a blob on them, and then you end up with a streak through the middle of the piece. So start on the tips every time and work your way up, and what you'll do is lighten off the tip and blend that up nicely. And all I'm doing as I'm working my way up, I'm getting slightly lighter with the pressure, so it's a little bit heavy on the tips, obviously not too heavy that I'm going to break them or anything, but just to apply that paint a little bit more. And then as I work my way up the ghost trails, it's a little bit lighter so that it's leaving a lot of that blue underneath from the nighthaunt gloom. Right, so carrying on with the ghosts on the side here, I'm just taking some dryad bark and applying a couple of thin down coats over the hoods and also for the flagpole that he's holding there. Obviously I want that in the dryad bark as well. So nice and simple, just get it straight up there, a couple of coats, and we can move on to the next step. Right, and I'm now applying some abaddon black over the musical instrument and the gold part at the top of the flagpole here. And what I've done now is thinned this down, and I'm going to apply this in a couple of layers, working my way from the flagpole towards the end of the flag, and then coming off and dipping into some water, just as I did with the nighthaunt gloom, just to thin it down slightly and basically wet blend and fade that off into the white. I'll do this a couple of times, obviously letting it dry on both sides until I get I'd say about 60 to 70% opacity of the abaddon black nearest the flagpole. And this is going to be basically an undershade for the colour that will go over the top. Okay, and finally, to finish off the throne, I'm just using some of that ulthuan grey to edge highlight some of the sharper edges, sort of the horizontal areas that will catch light, and obviously some of the vertical areas, as well as the top piece, the backrest that goes up and over the spooky ghost. You'll also notice with those spooky ghosts that I've applied a thinned down nighthaunt gloom, essentially a gloom wash into them, and you can see here I'm just sort of trying to dry brush and pick off some white areas, but I quickly decide against that. I'll do that with an actual dry brush after this, just to lighten up some of those highlights slightly for a little bit of work later on. Right, and then moving back to the hoods, I'm just going to apply a wash of agrax earthshade. This one is more of a wash than the glaze. You know, I want this pooling into the cracks and obviously getting all in that detail to make it stand out, the fatter areas, and that stand out a little bit more on the hoods. Okay, so I'm now taking some rhinox hide and I've mixed in a small amount of dryad bark just to tone down that redness a little bit. Rhinox hide is a little bit more of a reddish brown, and I want it obviously a little bit more muted. I didn't want it lighter, so I didn't use white to mute it. The dryad bark worked quite well for this, and then obviously I'm going over all of those flat areas and obviously picking out the highlights, but leaving the agrax earthshade in the recesses. I'll then take some baneblade brown and mix a small amount of that into the dryad bark and rhinox hide mix, and use this for edge highlighting. So essentially I've just lightened it down, and that gives me a bright enough highlight for the edge highlighting. Okay, so I've sped this next bit up slightly so that I can voice over the top of it and you can see the entire process. What I'm now doing is working on the flag. Oh, my speech today. So I'm working on the flag, and what I'm doing with this is using some khorne red. I'm using this neat, this isn't thinned down other than the small amount of water that I add when I transfer it into the dropper bottles. But all I'm doing is applying this neat, and then as you can see I'm dipping into the water a little bit and then fading it off and blending it down. Now this gives this is just the start of this flag process, so do bear with me on this. What I will then do, whilst the paint is wet, and if it's not I'll apply some more neat paint over the top, I want the area nearer the flagpole to be a lot darker. So what I do is dip into the black, the abaddon black, and start to blend that a little bit, and then I will apply that straight to the wet paint on the flag. And what that will do is I can then blend that into the red in an up and down motion, and the more that I move the brush up and down, the brush stroke in one spot, the more it will blend that black into the red and become more red. So if I wanted a short area of black and a large area of red, then obviously I would concentrate the black area without too much blending near the flagpole, and then very slowly come away with a lot of up and down strokes. If I want the black to fade out more, then I'll do less up and down strokes, obviously overlapping slightly, but I will keep that black on the brush more and move it out along the flag. I hope that makes sense. If not, then obviously you can see in the video here hopefully what I mean. If it's something that you guys would like me to do a separate video on, then let me know down in the comments, and I can do maybe a little bit of a blending tutorial. But obviously, as far as the blending goes, that is how I do my wet blending. I literally have wet paint on the model, wet paint on the brush of the other colour, and just blend the two, one over the top into the other. I tend to do this, have the slightly lighter colour applied first and the darker colour afterwards, so that I can blend it in better. I find if you have the darker colour and try to blend into the lighter colour, it doesn't work as well. Sorry, vice versa. So if you have the darker colour down first and you're trying to blend a lighter colour into it, it tends to just pick up that dark colour and muddy. It's a lot better if you go in with a light colour first and then have your darker colour on your brush and blend that in over the top. So I hope that explains it, and with seeing this little bit here you can see how I did the blending. Okay, so for the lighter portion of the flag, I'm now using some wazdakka red, and I'm using pretty much the same technique. You can see here with the glare on the paint that the darker paint is still wet, and basically I'm back and forwarding, up and down, to get that fade. You can see there that I do dip a little bit back into the khorne red and blend the two together, and then yeah, I'm just back and forth between the two colours and the black until I get the nice fade that I want between the whole thing. Now you do have to be careful with how much paint you are applying, because this isn't thinned down. You do run the risk of clogging up details if you do too many layers. What I'm doing whilst I'm applying this, it is going on thin, although it's staying wet and it's not watered down thin. The brush strokes are removing some of the paint and they are keeping it relatively thin, so that I can build up multiple layers. Not as many as I would do if it was thin down paint, but you can still get a good 4 or 5 layers on there, and then just blend the paint backwards and forwards to get the fade that you want. And then finally, for the ghost trails, I'm just using some slightly thinned down nighthaunt gloom. Now you can see I've applied some of this to the palette and then added a little bit of water to thin this down. I do have some dark reaper there that I'm dipping into. This is very similar to nighthaunt gloom in colour value, so I can use that as a wetter paint and then use the thin down nighthaunt gloom to actually get that fade for the ghost trails. And then doing a very similar thing to it as I did with the reds and blacks, I can then blend that in up the top there to get that into a slight that slight purple look. As that dries, that will fade down and give a nice fade into the ghost trails. Right, so once that has fully dried, I can go back in with the wazdakka red and just edge highlight all of the red areas, reaching up into the black slightly, going up towards the pole, but with a slightly less paint on the bristles. So obviously if I'm starting up one end, by the time I get to that darker end there's a little bit less paint on the bristles, and I also use the edge of the bristles a little bit further up where there is a little bit less paint to get that highlight there. And then finally, using the ulthuan grey and hiding it behind the palette cam there, with a dry brush, doing the exact same thing as I did for the other ghost trails, just starting on the tip and working my way up, dry brushing to get that fade into that whitish tip. Okay, so on this wavy part of the flag as it sort of bends towards you, in the reference work on the Games Workshop website there's a nice highlight that goes down the middle. So all I'm doing for this is taking some Evil Sunz Scarlet, very thin down into a glaze, and then working that over that centre area. This will then dry and obviously fade in with the colours either side of it. If I feel at some points that there's a little bit too much red gone on there of the Evil Sunz, I'll go back in with the khorne red, thinned down, and just blend that over the top slightly to fade the two in together. Right, so next up I'll take some retributor armour and very carefully apply this to the embossment design thing that's on the flag here, as well as the trumpet that one of the ghosts is holding. I'll also do the top piece of the flagpole and the rings that hold the flag to the pole in this as well. Now obviously I'm being very careful to try not to get any paint on the flag itself. I just want this on the gold areas. So all I'm doing is, with a little bit of a blob of paint on the end of my bristles right on the tip, I'm using that to move the paint around and get it where I need, rather than trying to touch the bristles to it. I find that if I touch the bristles to it, if I apply too much pressure, a couple of bristles are going to push off the edge and hit that flag. So I like to have a little bit more of a blob on the end of paint and use that to move around, basically to be able to see that fine point on the end of the bristles. The last couple of hairs, with my eyes I can't see them too well, so with a little bit of blob of paint on there I can see that, and then I know that I can push that around with the bristles being just underneath it. If the paint's there, then they're holding on to something, it's holding on to some bristles. So just the way that I do it, bit of paint on the end and then push it around. If I do happen to go onto the area around, I'll quickly rinse the brush off, tap it to some paper towel to remove most of the water, and then just using the tip of the brush sort of scrape the paint up like a backwards and forwards to sort of spread it thin and paint lift it up, and that will remove most of the paint. If I need to do a little bit of a touch up, then it will be with a small mix of khorne red and abaddon black that is thinned down, that I can then glaze up to match that fade of the flag itself. Right, and to finally finish off the throne, I'll apply a wash of agrax earthshade to the trumpeter, or the trumpet, and also to the gold area on the flag. Now you'll notice that although I'm following around or on the top of the pattern, I'm letting some of that nuln oil, or sorry, that agrax earthshade flow off of the top and then blend it over the top. What this does is just adds a little bit of tint to the flag itself. It's not going to be noticeable when it dries, but it does leave a little bit of agrax earthshade right around the detailing of that gold. And then you can see here I'm just applying a little bit of the agrax onto some of the flatter areas of gold, so that leaves a little bit more of a tint and stain there, and that saves me then from having to try and edge highlight with the gold itself afterwards. And with that, let it dry, and that is the throne done. Okay, and there he is, guys. Now, I was going to explain the process of painting Kurdos himself. However, his technique is exactly the same as that as the ghosts either side of him. Obviously, with his golden mace or whatever that weapon is, and then his crown as well, and the head of the mace being done with lead belcher and a wash of nuln oil. The only difference between Kurdos and the ghosts is the ulthuan grey I brought further up the cloak a little bit more, and I'd also blended the black down into the nighthaunt gloom a bit, so that when the ulthuan grey went over the top, that blended it. I then applied a glaze of Coelian green shade, I think that's Coelia green shade, down the cloak, starting from around about his neckline and ending just where the trails start to split off from each other. And what this did was gave a slight greenish spooky tint to him that the other two ghosts didn't have, just to make him stand out a little bit. I then dry brushed the ghosts on the throne behind his head and applied that same Coelia green shade wash to those as well. I then glued him into place, and there you have it, the finished model. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please be sure to hit that thumbs up button. If for any reason you want to hit that thumbs down button, please let me know in the comments why, so that I know what to improve in future videos. If you are newly subscribed to the channel, then a big warm welcome to you. Welcome to the inner circle, and thank you for supporting by subscribing. If you haven't yet subscribed, please consider doing so by hitting that subscribe button and checking us out for other content in the future. But until next time, guys, take it easy and keep painting those minis.